Metaphor. Years ago in a writing class, the professor talked about a poet who lost his mind trying to decide whether to live in the city or the country. 20 years I lived on that farm for the look of the orchard and the fields in mist, in rain, in snow, and most of all in blossom. Until in loneliness, one day I left it and began to long for it like everybody else. The other day at a party, I heard a single word fall toward me through the talk of friends like a tree uprooted, crashing through new green growth. Was it orchard? Was it pond? Or simply hill?
He started from very grounded, wherever he starts, where it was a landscape, or was he was looking at the sky, was he looking at the dirt in the field, plants, flowers. He's looking at a lot of things around him, surroundings of the nature, but it was never about that. It was always about paintings. So that stays all the way through, consistent. And he also kind of said, I want to be an abstract painter. Warren, Jane was her soulmate and friend. So everything Warren was doing, he was talking to Jane. And so we knew Jane was always behind coming up with the titles and organizing everything for his archives and the paintings. So she was always there.
People have a kind of sense of the rhythm of work, and I think that allows people to be interested in that idea of dot, 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 line, and having an almost kinesthetic relationship with the person who made it. There's a kind of landscape reference, like often the little dots march uphill or downhill or up and then downhill. There's a kind of swelling and a kind of change that looks a little bit like the agricultural landscape.
Rohrer's paintings are very subtle, and you might see a field of color at first. But in many cases, Edge of Red, for instance, you get in close and you see very small gestures, very small marks that trace topographical lines that gradually shift in color and that really give an impression of a subtle topography in nature that is quite compelling. He is taking the idea of the field and abstracting it. I find that since I've seen these paintings, I'm driving through Pennsylvania and I do look out at fields differently.
Well, it's clear they work from the same world. And her poems refer often to fields, to colors, to seasons, to the pheasant. How do you translate experience into something visual? How do you translate experience into something verbal?
It's from the persistence in his work of the textures of the life that he knew, of having your hands in the earth in central Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, living on Christiana Farm, knowing what farmers do when they cut furrows back and forth in the earth. You feel that in his paintings, even though you can't look at them and say, this is a landscape. We're so conscious of these fields of paint being fields of earth, of farms. And there's this great sense of human activity, right? That the lines in his paintings are parallel to each other, even though they're organic. They shift off in one direction, they shift off in another direction. And that sense of movement and time and space is something that I feel, Jane gives in the poetry. One of the pairs of poem and painting we will offer involves the painting Conflicting Thought and the poem by Jane In the Studio. And this is actually the poem where the title of the exhibition comes from. That intimacy between painter and poet is expressed so beautifully, and that's what we want our exhibition to be able to do, for the poems to be able to open up the paintings, and for the paintings, likewise, to be able to open up the poems.
In the studio. In the studio, he is brushing stroke by rose madder stroke on the clean ground of the canvas. The documentary filmmaker leans close, his big camera obscuring his head. The local newspaper photographer leans into the space behind the filmmaker, adjusts his lens, and photographs the filmmaker, filming the artist painting. I am a camera. This is your picture of what I see. Now you are in the picture, and behind you stands one who sees the whole thing. And behind him, his ear close, hearing the brush.
Words there become almost physical in the poem, kind of like the stroke. She asks us to pay attention to what the poem is made of in a way that could be connected to the paintings.
Warren's work is a human response to the world around you, and that's nature. It's not just on the surface, it's embedded in the painting itself, the history, what came before.
Well, the writing element, I think, is important, whether you call it calligraphic or whether even if you deal with the stroke itself. I mean, I think of these paintings as being like messages and that are for people to read. The calligraphic thing is not an attempt to be oriental and to use calligraphy in that sense, as much as it's a language that I guess I have started to read in the landscape.